On July 13, 1973, in a boardroom in St. Louis, Missouri, McDonnell Douglas is about to make a decision that will cost the company its future. On the table, a twin-engine version of their DC-10. European airlines are ready to place orders. Development cost is just $250 million. The engineering is sound, and the market is waiting. The board says no. Not because the aircraft is flawed, or because airlines don't want it, but because James McDonnell, the company's founder and chairman, insists on something the Douglas side cannot deliver: an American airline launch order. That single decision will hand the twin-engine wide-body market to Boeing and Airbus, a market worth over $100 billion and 8,500 aircraft. To understand how McDonnell Douglas arrived at that moment, you have to go back 7 years to 1966, when American Airlines had a problem. The airline was watching Boeing develop the 747, but American's route network didn't need something that large. What they needed was a wide body, but sized for around 250 passengers. And ideally, it would have just 2 engines. Because 2 engines meant lower purchase costs, simpler maintenance, and reduced fuel consumption. For airlines operating on thin margins, that mattered. But there was a problem. In 1953, the Federal Aviation Administration had established what became known as the 60-minute rule. Any twin-engine commercial aircraft could only fly routes that kept it within 60 minutes of a suitable airport. If one engine failed, the aircraft had to be able to reach a diversion field on the remaining engine within an hour. For airlines hoping to fly across oceans or over remote terrain, this was a deal-breaker. 4-engine jets were exempt, but twin-engine aircraft? They'd be restricted to routes hugging coastlines or staying near airports. So Douglas aircraft engineers came back with a counter-proposal. What if we make it 3 engines instead? 3 engines could fly anywhere a 4-engine jet could, while still being more efficient than hauling around that 4th power plant. It was a compromise. Not what American Airlines originally requested, but close enough. American Airlines accepted, so did other carriers. And in February 1968, American placed the launch order for the Douglas DC-10. Lockheed, meanwhile, was developing their own 3-engine wide-body, the L-1011 TriStar. Both aircraft would carry a 3rd engine mounted in the tail. The DC-10 fed its center engine through an S-shaped duct. Lockheed mounted theirs directly to the vertical stabilizer. Both configurations worked. Both added weight and complexity. And both existed because of a regulation, not because 3 engines was the ideal engineering solution. But Douglas engineers never stopped thinking about the twin-engine version. Beginning in 1966, twin-engine designs had been studied alongside the trijet configuration, and by March 1973, they'd worked out a complete 2-engine variant. The DC-10 twin was remarkably straightforward. Remove the tail-mounted engine and its S-duct, shorten the fuselage by 14 feet, widen the wingspan by 6 feet, and mount 2 engines under the wings. 2 engine options were proposed. General Electric's CF650C producing 51,000 pounds of thrust each, or Pratt & Whitney's JT9D engines at 52,000 pounds thrust, for a total of just over 100,000 pounds. The standard DC-10 carried 120,000 pounds of thrust from 3 engines. But with the lighter airframe, no 3rd engine, no S-duct, and a shorter fuselage, the twin needed less. Passenger capacity would remain similar to the trijet, between 239 and 300 seats, depending on configuration. The range was projected at 2,160 nautical miles, perfect for high-density medium-haul routes like Chicago to Los Angeles or London to Rome. These routes never crossed oceans, so the 60-minute rule didn't matter. But the real advantage was fleet commonality. McDonnell Douglas claimed 93% parts commonality with the DC-10 and 89% with the longer-range DC-10. The cockpit would be nearly identical. 2 throttle levers instead of 3, simplified engine instrumentation, but otherwise the same layout. Pilots type-rated on the DC-10 could transition to the twin with minimal additional training. Airlines operating DC-10s could share maintenance facilities, ground equipment, spare parts inventories, and training programs. This wasn't a brand new aircraft requiring complete certification and years of service validation. It was a family member, and that made it commercially attractive in ways a completely new design could never match. For airlines already operating DC-10s, adding the twin to their fleet would be seamless. For airlines considering their first wide-body purchase, the DC-10 twin offered efficiency without sacrificing the redundancy perception that 3 engines provided. At least, not in a way that would trigger the 60-minute rule on domestic routes. Development cost was estimated at just $250 million. Compare that to the billions Boeing would later spend developing the 767 from scratch, or the government-backed funding Airbus was pouring into the A300. By early 1973, the aircraft was ready. Engineering drawings were complete, performance projections had been calculated, and McDonnell Douglas began trying to sell it to airlines. To understand why the DC-10 twin died, you need to understand what McDonnell Douglas actually was. Because the name suggests unity, but the reality was very different. In 1967, McDonnell Aircraft Corporation merged with Douglas Aircraft Company. On paper, it created one of America's largest aerospace manufacturers, but in practice, it created a company at war with itself. Douglas Aircraft, based in Long Beach, California, had built legendary commercial aircraft for decades. The DC-3, the DC-8, the DC-9. They understood airlines and knew how carriers made purchasing decisions. They'd built relationships with airline executives going back to the 1930s. McDonnell Aircraft, headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri, was a defense contractor. They built fighters for the Navy and Air Force, like the F-4 Phantom and F-15 Eagle. They understood military procurement, specifications, cost control, and hierarchical decision-making. But commercial aviation was foreign territory. Leading McDonnell was James Smith McDonnell. He founded the company in 1939 and built it through discipline, efficiency, and absolute control. He was known throughout the company as Mr. Mac, and he ran McDonnell Douglas the way he'd run McDonnell Aircraft, like a military operation. His authority was absolute. When executives challenged him, he had a famous response: "You're the CEO, and I am the boss." The Douglas side understood that commercial aviation required risk-taking. Airlines couldn't order aircraft that didn't exist. You had to commit development funds, build prototypes, demonstrate capability, then the orders would follow. That's how the DC-8 beat the Boeing 707 to market, and how the DC-9 became one of the most successful narrow-bodies ever built. But the McDonnell side, shaped by military contracting, insisted on guaranteed orders before committing funds. In defense work, that made sense. The government issued specifications. You bid on the contract, you won or lost. In commercial aviation, that approach didn't work, because carriers needed to see the aircraft, evaluate it, and compare it to competitors. Launch customers took risks alongside manufacturers. The relationship was a partnership, not procurement. These two cultures would collide over the DC-10 twin, and when they did, the McDonnell perspective would win. Because James McDonnell was the boss. Throughout 1972 and early 73, McDonnell Douglas staged elaborate marketing presentations for the DC-10 twin at their Long Beach facility. Contemporary photographs show company executives demonstrating cutaway seat models to airline representatives. In what might be the most on-the-nose marketing gimmick in aviation history, the company even hired actual twins as promotional models. Two women, identically dressed, standing next to a DC-10 model, emphasizing the twin engine concept. The European response was enthusiastic. Swissair expressed strong interest, and so did Scandinavian Airlines. The KSSU Group, a purchasing consortium of KLM and UTA, heavily favored the DC-10 twin. These weren't tentative inquiries. These were airlines prepared to place launch orders. For context, this was more interest than Airbus had secured for their A300 at the same stage. By 1977, 4 years after service entry, Airbus had sold just 38 A300s total. 16 completed aircraft sat unsold in Toulouse as whitetails, unpainted aircraft with no buyer. But McDonnell Douglas had willing European customers in 1973, before the DC-10 twin had even been built. American carriers were more cautious. North Central Airlines examined it, but determined the capacity was too large for their regional route network. They operated from Minneapolis and Detroit to secondary cities. 250 seats was overkill. Northwest Airlines, despite already operating DC-1040, declined. They stated their fleet planning was well balanced, and they didn't want the complexity of operating a subtype. The larger US carriers hesitated for a different reason: the 60-minute rule. United, American, and Delta wanted wide bodies for transatlantic routes, and a twin-engine aircraft in 1973 couldn't do that legally. Most wide-body routes were domestic, like Chicago to Los Angeles, New York to Miami, or San Francisco to Seattle. These high-density routes never crossed oceans and could profitably use a twin-engine wide-body immediately. The major carriers were focused on transatlantic operations, and for that, the DC-10 twin was restricted. So by mid-1973, McDonnell Douglas had a situation: strong European interest and modest American interest, and a development cost of just $250 million, less than 10% of what the company would later lose betting on the MD-11 program. On July 13, 1973, the McDonnell Douglas board convened to make a final decision on the DC-10 twin. The Douglas executives made their case. European airlines were ready to commit. The development cost was modest, only $250 million. The engineering was complete. Performance projections showed the aircraft would be competitive, and fleet commonality with the existing DC-10 would give it an advantage no clean-sheet competitor could match. But James McDonnell had a requirement. He wanted a US airline launch order, not European commitments, a major one. That was non-negotiable. The problem was simple. No major US carrier had placed a firm order. They were interested, but they were waiting to see how the 60-minute rule might evolve, to evaluate competing designs from Boeing and Airbus, and for the kind of certainty that only comes after an aircraft enters service. This was normal in commercial aviation. Launch customers took risks. Early adopters helped validate the design. Then the rest of the market followed. It's how the DC-8 and 727 had succeeded, and how every successful commercial aircraft had ever succeeded. But McDonnell's military contracting background demanded different assurances. In defense work, you didn't build without a contract. The government specified requirements. You bid, you won or lost. Risk was minimized. Return was guaranteed. Commercial aviation didn't work that way, and the Douglas executives knew it. Jackson McGowan had been president of Douglas Aircraft from 1968 to 1972. He understood airlines and built the relationships. He'd negotiated the deals that made the DC-9 one of the most successful narrow-bodies in history and oversaw the DC-10 launch. And he was bullish on the DC-10 twin. Years later, in a 2024 interview, McGowan reflected on the decision. "I was bullish on the DC-10 twin," he said. "The risk would have been minimal, and at the time, development costs were put at just $250 million. The orders were there from European airlines such as Swissair and SAS, but Mr. Mack insisted on a US carrier." But by July 1973, McGowan had already resigned. He'd left earlier that year at age 55, young enough for a second career, but walking away from the company he'd served for decades. The frustration had become too much. In that same interview, he admitted why. "I knew damn well that with the McDonnell's influence, Douglas was not going anyplace." His successor, John Brizendine, continued advocating for the DC-10 twin. So did other Douglas executives, but they faced the same obstacle. Without a US carrier, McDonnell wouldn't approve the program. And so, on July 13, 1973, the board voted not to proceed. The DC-10 twin was cancelled, not because it was poorly designed or because airlines didn't want it, but because the corporate culture of a military contractor couldn't accommodate the risk profile of commercial aviation. European airlines that had been ready to order looked elsewhere. Some eventually bought the Airbus A300. Others waited for Boeing's 767, which wouldn't be announced for another 5 years. And McDonnell Douglas? They continued building 3-engine DC-10s, aircraft that were increasingly expensive to operate compared to the twin-engine wide-bodies that would soon dominate the market. The window of opportunity had closed, and it would never reopen. Meanwhile, Airbus was struggling with their own twin-engine wide-body. The A300 had entered service in 1974, but by 1977 had secured just 38 orders. 16 completed aircraft sat unsold in Toulouse. The program was saved only by desperate measures, leasing 4 aircraft to Eastern Airlines for $1 per year in 1977, which finally provided American market credibility. If the DC-10 twin had launched in 1975, Airbus might not have survived. But McDonnell Douglas had cancelled their twin 2 years earlier, and by the time they realized their mistake, the market had moved on. Because the 60-minute rule that had seemed so immovable was about to crumble. On February 1, 1985, the FAA granted what became known as ETOPS 120 certification. Extended Range Twin-Engine Operations Performance Standards were now 120 minutes. Transworld Airlines could now operate their 767s on transatlantic routes, as long as they stayed within 120 minutes of a suitable diversion airport. TWA Flight 810 operated the first revenue flight under these new rules from Boston to Paris. The performance advantage was immediate. That 767 burned 7,000 pounds less fuel per hour than an L1011 on the same route. Operating costs dropped accordingly, and airlines took notice. 3 years later, in 1988, the FAA approved ETOPS 180. That covered approximately 95% of Earth's surface. Twin-engine widebodies could now fly virtually any route: trans-Pacific, polar, and remote oceanic. The restrictions that had forced airlines to accept 3-engine aircraft in 1968 had completely vanished. The regulatory barrier that killed the DC-10 twin in 1973 was gone within 12 years of the cancellation. But McDonnell Douglas had no twin-engine widebody to sell. Boeing did, and Airbus did. McDonnell Douglas was still building trijets. The consequences of July 13, 1973, manifested gradually. Initially, the DC-10 trijet succeeded. Production peaked at 57 aircraft in 1973 itself. American, United, and Continental operated them profitably on domestic and international routes. But this merely disguised the strategic error. When Boeing announced the 767 on July 14, 1978, just 5 years after the DC-10 twin cancellation, They presented exactly the aircraft McDonnell Douglas could have launched 3 years earlier. United Airlines placed the launch order for 30 aircraft. The first flight came September 26, 1981. Entry into service followed September 8, 1982. The timing was perfect. ETOPS 120 approval arrived in 1985, just as airlines were building their twin wide-body fleets. The 767 became the transatlantic workhorse. By the late 1980s, more than 50% of transatlantic flights were operated by 767s. Airbus recovered from near death. After the Eastern Airlines breakthrough in 1977, momentum accelerated. The A300 and the A310 would eventually deliver over 800 aircraft combined. In 1981, McDonnell Douglas lost the number 2 position in commercial aviation to Airbus. Structural. The MD story epitomizes the dysfunction. Launched in 1986 to compete with A7 and A330, fundamentally a stretched D-10 with winglets systems. Douglas engineers requested funding for a new wing operating heavier aircraft. Refused. The resulting aircraft failed to meet performance guarantees. Launch customers were furious. Airlines ordered just 200 against projections exceeding 300. Production ceased in the 2000s as customers defected to twin-engine wide. The company that built the DC-10 was gone. They were absorbed into Boeing. The Long Beach facility eventually closed, and tens of thousands disappeared. Traced back to July 13, 1973. James McDonnell said no to a $150 million investment and handed the future of aviation to his competitors. The DC-10 twin sits in history as a peculiar artifact. It wasn't a failure or even a mistake in the science. It was an aircraft that never got the chance to fail, succeed. Engineers had technical problems and airlines had expressed interest. The market would eventually prove them right. Twin-engine widebodies did exactly what Douglas predicted they would, and that was dominate commercial aviation for decades. But military contractor thinking applied to commercial aviation killed it before any part of the plane was built, and before anyone could prove whether it would have worked. The 60-minute rule changed, and engine reliability improved. The market evolved exactly as Douglas engineers predicted. They were right. They just weren't allowed to prove it. If you want more videos on interesting aircraft that never happened, don't forget to subscribe for more.